All right, everybody, welcome. So this is creation episode number 11. It is probably the last one we're going to do that we're not necessarily going to talk about scripture. I just wanted to cover one last little section with you. Um, these past three episodes, 9, 10, and 11, have been focused on kind of evidence of the flood and, giving you a little eye candy with some pictures and some interesting stuff that is not necessarily presented in the world. In episode 9, we talked about Niagara Falls and and the rate that it's walking backwards or was walking backwards before it was fortified with concrete. We talked about the erosion in the Grand Canyon. We talked about the Little Grand Canyon that was created by the eruption of Mount St. Helens and the erosion. We talked about coal deposits and the rapid burial of all this forest matter that is still in a green state, not dried and crispy. And in episode 10, we talked about fossils, how quickly they're made, that they don't take millions of years to form. I showed you some man-made objects that have been fossilized, such as a hat and wire fence. And I think we covered the fact that there's like no missing links in any of the fossils. Like there's no in-betweens. It's either animals that don't exist anymore or animals that do, but there's never any cross animals at all in any of the fossil record. We talked about humans and dinosaurs existing at the same point. I showed you some pictures of some dinosaur footprints and then possibly what is a human footprint inside of a dinosaur footprint. And I showed you my favorite thing, which is the Nile Mosaic of Palestrina, which I think is it's absolutely fantastic and beautiful. I'm so glad that it was found and preserved. And so tonight, what I wanted to do was, next week we're going to get back into scripture and we're going to talk about some other stuff. But tonight, what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about what if the young Earth model fits, meaning the Earth isn't as old as we think it is. So, you take things like if fossils don't take millions of years to create, and we look around at our Earth and we see the changes that take place just over our lifespan. For instance, my house. My house was built in 1939, and it was built with a 3-foot crawl space underneath it. And the foundation has settled in some spots. I'm not going to lie about that. It's settled about 3 inches on the edges. And so when you walk in my house, it's actually it's bent in half over the spine of the house. But interestingly enough, if you go into the crawl space, the entire structure is now at its highest point from the ground, 18 inches. So we've roughly accumulated, in the 100 years that the house has been built, we've roughly accumulated almost 18 inches of sediment on top of the dirt that the house was originally formed in. And so, you look at stuff like that and you're like, well, wait a minute, how can the Earth be billions of years old if every 100 years we're creating 18 inches of sediment? Stuff like that. People talk about stuff that isn't necessarily easy to prove or irrefutable, such as the salt content in the ocean, the moon walking away from Earth, moon receding from Earth, I guess is the way to put it, and the distance that it's receded, and how if the Earth has been around for 4 billion years, then the moon would have actually been touching the surface of the Earth. And one interesting fact I find that is extremely fascinating is the sun is shrinking, and so as it goes closer and closer into its core, it's eventually going to collapse on itself, and then it turns into a giant red dwarf, and it'll actually swallow the Earth if the Earth is still around at that point in time. But it's shrinking, and it's like, I think it's 5 feet a year. You'll have to look that one up. Don't quote me on that. But it matches the exact reference from Earth that we see that the moon is walking away. So as the moon walks away from the Earth, the sun shrinks. So those two always appear to be the same size to our eyes. I think stuff like that is really cool. But what I wanted to hit on tonight was I get carried away with this stuff because I love it so much. What I wanted to get into tonight is show you some evidence of young Earth uh, from a physical point of view, right? Stuff that you're familiar with, you can see, you can touch, you can go visit, and it's not like I'm not going to tell you that what I'm showing you tonight is solid proof. I'm going to tell you that what I'm showing you tonight shows you the possibility that the Bible is absolutely correct. As I have stated before in these episodes, I 100% believe the Bible is 100% correct and exactly as it is written, meaning that the earth is less than 10,000 years old. What I'm going to show you tonight is things that raise the suspicion of that being true to a higher level. I never want to come at you and tell you that the stuff I'm showing you is absolute fact and can't be refuted because we don't know anything. I mean, think about the stuff that is knowledge that has changed just over my lifetime, right? So I'm 46. I grew up. I was an 80s kid, right? I was a teenager in the 90s. Uh, really grew up in the 80s when aerobics and leg warmers were in fashion. And one of the big things then was that eggs were killing people, and they're raising your cholesterol level, and if you eat eggs, you're basically going to die, whatever. And that was scientific fact. And when I was born in 1975, there was a gigantic scientific effort to learn how to prevent global cooling. Neither of those things have panned out to be true. Eggs are actually quite good for you, and they have a good kind of cholesterol in them. And we're now fighting global warming, supposedly, or climate change, right? So nothing I present to you tonight or in the past episodes is 100% solid scientific fact. You can, lay $100 bill on it. That's not my point here. My point here is to give you confidence in the Bible and show you stuff that piques that interest. So I want to talk about before we get into some of the things that kind of show the young Earth model, right? So if you think the Earth's been around for 4,000 years, if we have buildings from like the 900s that are still standing, which we do, there's some churches and actually some pubs, some bars in Europe that were built in the 900s, thousands, the 1100s. Uh, they're really old, and if you look at them, if there was no human care, they wouldn't exist anymore. And a lot of the oldest buildings that we have in existence have fallen into disrepair. But we know that history. That was around the time that Jesus was around. And so uh, you look at the world and you got to say, well, okay, so if the flood, like we talked about in previous episodes, if the flood truly, like as the Bible states, destroyed the earth. And when we say the earth, what we mean is the soil of the earth, what we call the ground, right? The flood completely destroyed the ground, rearranged it, reformed it, messed everything up, turned everything topsy turvy, gave us our coal deposits, gave us trees that were, you know, that appear as if they're fossilized inside of mountains, et cetera, et cetera. We had all this huge change take place. If since that time there's only been about 4,000 years, give or take, then we have to be able to see stuff, right? We have to be able to find things that indicate there's got to be something left that's 4,000 years old. And so you get into this thing where you start looking at some of the oldest known things on Earth and having a look at them to see what their age is and stuff like that. And so one of the things that I find so interesting is from an evolutionary standpoint, and I promise you we're getting to the young Earth stuff, but from an evolutionary standpoint, things like crocodiles and alligators shouldn't exist. There's no way they're in their best form, right? And if they've had millions upon millions of years. Like alligators and crocodiles are said to be living dinosaurs. I mean, so are chickens, but whatever. They're said to be living dinosaurs, right? So does that mean they've reached their evolutionary peak? Because we've only been around as a species for about 100,000 years, according to scientists. And we've evolved. We've completely changed. Our brain size has changed. Our body size has changed. Our knowledge of, of our environment has completely changed. We have things like, superconductors and computers and silicone chips, and you carry around an encyclopedia slash calculator slash camera slash video camera slash telephone in your pocket that you only need to charge once a day, right? And so you look at alligators and you say, well, okay, so they're literally at the peak of their possible evolution. There's no way. There's absolutely no way. It makes no sense whatsoever. And so one of those creatures that's like that, that comes from what they call the prehistoric era, is the horseshoe crab. And I don't know how often you get to go to the beach or whatever, but everybody should be pretty familiar. Here's a little picture of them, right? Here's a group of them on the beach. Atlantic coast is well known for horseshoe crabs. They have this cool stuff called blue blood. It's based on copper instead of iron, so it's blue instead of red. A bunch of scientific uses for it. They actually catch the crabs and they drain their blood off little by little, hoping to keep them alive so they can drain more blood off. They keep them in tanks and stuff. But that still goes on today. But the interesting thing about the horseshoe crab is if we follow the old Earth model, they are 450 million years old. So if they're 450 million years old, that means that horseshoe crab, which is actually not a crab but more like a scorpion, that horseshoe crab is at its complete peak, meaning it can get no better than it is. And while there's some amazing things about the horseshoe crab, such as its eye structure and the way it can amplify light at night 1,000,000 times more than a normal eye, there's some really cool things about them. There is no way that they are at their evolutionary peak. The other interesting thing about the horseshoe crab is it was around 450 million years ago, and then it disappeared for 148 million years in the fossil record, according to old Earth belief. And then it just reappeared. So it went from 450 million years, it disappeared for 148 million years, and then all of a sudden it reappeared. Stuff like that makes absolutely no sense to me. And we talked about this last week, or not last week, last episode or a couple episodes ago. There's very few animals that we find that aren't on Earth today. Meaning if you find a mouse in fossil form, it looks like a mouse today. If you find a kangaroo in fossil form, it looks like a kangaroo today. If you find an ostrich in fossil form, it looks like an ostrich today. All the animals, right? Duck-billed platypus still is duck-billed platypus. You're telling me the duck-billed platypus is the best that the duck-billed platypus can do? So that right there, it makes you stop and say, wait a minute. If everything is evolving and it takes millions of years to evolve, you take the horseshoe crabs, 450 million years old. It's hardly even they talk about species differences between the 450 million year old horseshoe crab and the modern day horseshoe crab, and it's like so minuscule that you're like, that is the same animal. So you look at them and you're like, okay, so 450 million years and you haven't changed one bit. There's no way that the horseshoe crab is 450 million years old. There's no way the alligators and crocodiles are 450 million years old, or 500 million years, or 600 million years, or 100 million years old. There's no way. And from a human perspective, our current species, they say, has been around for 100,000 years. And we've seen dramatic changes in our own species. Let's talk about the the actual timeline, because I don't do that very often because it's very hard to pin down. And if you talk to one biblical scholar, you'll get one answer. If you talk to another biblical scholar, you'll get another answer. But we're looking at about 4,369 years ago. It's 2021. So 4,369 years ago, the earth was completely destroyed by this flood, right? What we call Noah's flood, even though it was God's flood, and Noah survived it. So it was in the year 2348 BC. And so we've got about a 4,400 year span since everything started over. Remember, we talked about marine life possibly surviving because God did not explicitly state that they would all be destroyed. So everything on land was recalibrated, so to speak. And only the animals that were on the ark survived. Everything else was drowned, washed up, covered up, turned into fossils, rotted, decayed, whatever. That being the case, we know we have a limited time span to work with, right? So again, we go back, we look at human history, and we say, okay, well, the oldest buildings are around 900, 1000 AD sort of thing, right? So the oldest buildings are about 1,000 years old, and they're still standing. So there has to be a way that we can look at something in the natural world, something that man is not involved in, something that could possibly remain, the first seed that sprouted after the flood, right? That sort of thing. And so I wanted to show you a couple of examples of that you will be aware of. And one of those is the bristlecone pine. And I know this is really exciting. All of you arborists out there. These are the oldest known trees. They are in North America. They're in California, on the eastern side of California, so away from the coast, right? They're up in, I guess, the high desert region where it's a little drier. And I got a picture of one here. You've seen them before. So this is kind of what they look like. They're a real scrubby looking little pine. They have some really cool things about them. One is that if a limb is not doing well, the tree will just cut off fluid to it to conserve fluid, so it doesn't waste water. And so that's why you often see them with these dead branches and stuff on them, etc. And they are the oldest known tree. So people will say, well, what about bonsai trees? What about whatever trees? What about this tree? Apparently, these are the oldest trees. And strangely enough, if you cut one open to look and see what's going on, how many rings it has, whatever, it has this amazing ability to produce 2 growth rings every season. So in the spring and in the fall, when it rains wherever they are, it grows basically twice as much as it does during the summer and fall. Whereas in normal trees, most of the growth is in the summer. You look at those growth rings on those trees, and it turns out those trees, the oldest one that we have found that we know of, scientists look at these things all the time, supposedly. It happens to just so be 4,000 years old. So the oldest known tree that we know of on Earth is a bristlecone pine. And the bristlecone pine is 4,000 years old. That's provable, right? So you can go and find the oldest one, find the biggest one, or the gnarliest looking one. I don't know how you find the oldest tree. I don't know. You go ask it for his driver's license, whatever. You go find the oldest one, cut it open, or take a core sample. I guess you don't want to kill it, right? So you take a little sample of it where you go through the middle of the tree, and you count the rings, and sure enough, the oldest ones that they find are roughly 4,000 years old. It gets even better. So the thing about the bristlecone pine that is so fascinating, and the reason why it's one of the oldest living trees, is because it has no natural predators. And when I say predator, you're like, what? It has no, like, insects don't burrow in it, right? Its wood is nobody likes it. It's rot resistant. Bugs don't like it. It lives in an area where the high winds don't affect it. It's not a very big tree. There's very little that can happen to them. They just kind of grow, and they grow slowly, and they just hang on, and they kind of live forever. And when one piece of them dies, they just kind of cut off fluid to it, and it just kind of hangs there as like a dead limb. And these things are all over the place. In fact, they have a whole forest based on the bristlecone pine. So it's pest and rot resistant and drought resistant, and it's a slow growth tree. So that's why we can look at them. That's why they are the oldest trees, right? They don't succumb to the things like around here in Georgia, like oak trees or pecan trees, where they get infested with bugs, or woodpeckers come and drill a bunch of holes in them, and then you get rot and you get limbs breaking off, and trees splitting in half, and all of these things happening. It doesn't happen to these, and so they're a great measure of the oldest vegetation on Earth. And then, aside from them, also in California is also another great example of the oldest trees on Earth, and those are the giant sequoias. I'm going to show you a picture of General Sherman. It's said to be the biggest one that exists. It's not a very good picture. Um, I got to get these from the internet. I got to put an attribution on them so people know where they came from, so I'm not trying to like take credit for taking the picture. Um, this is General Sherman. I guess it's one of the biggest giant sequoias around, and Giant Sequoia National Park is where most of these trees are. They also happen to be rot and decay resistant. In fact, very seldom do you find a dead tree. There's very few trees that have died. So if you go to the Giant Sequoia National Park, if a man has not been involved in either digging a tunnel through one or trying to cut one down with a chainsaw, there's very few dead trees, and the ones that are dead are usually younger. So these trees last forever. They last forever. Um, they also happen to all be about, take a guess, 4,000 years old. I think the oldest one that they know of, supposedly, is 4,320 years old. And you want to talk about putting a pin on a map. 4,320, and we're talking about 4,369. Now, obviously, these numbers are not exact, and I'm okay with that. But if you look at the entire Sequoia National Forest, and all of the trees are roughly 4,000 years old or younger, and you look at the bristlecone pine, which is the oldest known tree in the world, and all of those trees are 4,000 years old or younger, it tends to lend to the idea that the oldest of these trees started growing roughly 4,000 years ago when the floodwaters receded. And it doesn't mean that these trees didn't exist before. They could have very easily existed before, but as we talked about, God wiped the entire earth clean, right? There would have been no standing trees. Nothing would have survived. He was very specific about destroying the land, destroying the earth is the biblical line. So then I got two more I want to show you. I wanted to kind of keep tonight around the 30-minute mark. I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but we'll try. So the largest living organism that you can see from space is the Great Barrier Reef, right? And it's not a single organism, it's a group of organisms. It's in Australia. I'm sure, again, all of you are familiar with it. So the Great Barrier Reef is said to have been around for, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of years, whatever. The thing is in the thickest parts, let me get rid of this picture of General Sherman and show you this one. So this is what it looks like from space, right? Gigantic. If you know how big Australia is, which Australia is enormous, then you know just by looking at this picture how big the Great Barrier Reef is, and this is just a section of it that I'm showing you. And this is actually from a satellite, so this is like a spacecraft flying over, looking at the Earth. This is what you see. This is how big it is. So, in the thickest sections of the Great Barrier Reef, which are the oldest sections, obviously, because as a reef grows, what happens is layers go on top of layers, right? So, the thickest sections are going to be the tallest, widest sections of reef, not wreath, reef. So, in the thickest sections of the reef, there are the Great Barrier Reef is about 180 feet thick. Now, 180 feet thick is pretty thick when you think about, it's basically just dead coral on top of dead coral on top of dead coral, and then the top layer is live coral. And when that coral dies, new coral will form on top of it. And they've done a bunch of studies on. They've taken core samples. They've done all sorts of stuff. They've probably done some pretty destructive stuff in the past with lopping off huge sections to look at, etc. And they're getting more careful as time goes on. But that comes out to 180 feet, comes out to about 2,160 inches. And, they take all these core samples, they do all this study, and they find out that it grows on average. There's good years and there's bad years, just like everything else. I'm talking about an average. It grows on average 15 millimeters a year, or a half inch. Strangely enough, if you take 2,160 and say, okay, so it grows half an inch every year, then you would take 2,160 inches and you'd multiply by 2. When you do that, you get 4,320 years old. Sound familiar? So Great Barrier Reef comes in as well as a post-flood piece of evidence, I guess is the best way to put it. And they've done studies. I think they've been measuring the reef since the late 1700s on its growth rate, and it's been pretty steady. There's been years where it's boomed, and there's been years where it's busted, but it averages out about a half inch a year. And so you look at that and you say, okay. So we have the bristlecone pine, which is the oldest tree. We have the biggest tree, which is giant sequoias. They're both 4,000 years old. We have the largest organism on Earth, which is the Great Barrier Reef, which is actually a collection of tiny organisms, right? But it acts as one big one. It's been around forever. It's 4,000 years old. And you start to put these things together, and you start to say, okay, well, I don't need to look at all these confusing things like radioisotopes, helium molecules, the shrinking of the sun, lunar recession, short life of comets, all of this stuff that has so many holes in it. You can just look at simple stuff. We don't have to get all crazy. A lot of times the wisdom of God comes from simple things. God is not complicated, and he doesn't keep secrets. It's all right in front of your face. You can go see as soon as COVID's over, you can go see the Great Barrier Reef. You can fly down there, you can swim around, you can talk to a scientist. They'll tell you the average growth rate is half an inch a year, and the thickest section we know of is 180 feet, et cetera, et cetera. And you put those two together, and you're like, okay, well, that adds up. You can drive out to California or fly out to California and go see the bristlecone pine. You can go see the giant sequoia trees. You can go up to the redwood forest, right? Look at these beautiful giant trees and know that the oldest ones that they find are 4,000 years old. The oldest buildings that we know of, right? Because we can't date the pyramids. We don't know how old they are. We make an assumption, right? The Mayan temple, we don't know how old it is. But you look at the structures that we are 100% sure of because, modern human that could read and write was there when it was built. You have an idea. You start to see things, the oldest buildings we have that are, they're barely standing. There's anything left without human intervention. 4,000 years is a long stretch of time, a huge stretch of time. And so the last thing that I wanted to show you tonight, so again, we talked about a horseshoe crab, right? It's 450 million years old, hasn't evolved. we talked about bristlecone pine, giant sequoia tree, the Great Barrier Reef. Those are those are four easy things for you to remember, right? Four easy things for you to remember. You're very commonly knowledgeable about all of them. I want to talk to you about human population. So I don't know what it is today because it changes every day. Uh, it's around 7 billion. There's 7 billion people on the earth, and when you think about 7 billion, you're like, wow, that's a lot of people. But it's actually not. I think if everybody stood shoulder to shoulder, you could fit on one of the islands of Hawaii. I think that's right, something like that. So we could all mash together, shoulder to shoulder, and we could stand in a very small spot. The human population is not nearly as big as it could be, not even remotely close. And the interesting thing about human population is over recorded history. So that's age of the Bible. Let's just say the age of the New Testament up, because that's when writing became more common, right? People being able to write, and then recording history became more common because more people could write, and documents were surviving, and things like that. Human growth rate has been set. It doubles roughly between every 140, doubles roughly between every 125 to 150 years. So, or 155 years. So I pegged it at 140, right? So you say, okay, every 140 years, the population doubles. And so if you look at that and you say, okay, well, there's 7 billion people. 7 billion is a huge number. But that means 140 years ago, there were 3.5 billion. And 140 years before that, there were 100 or 1.25 or whatever it would be. My math skills right now are horrible because my brain's fried. 1.75 billion people, right? And before that, it was 800 million. Before that, it was 400 million. You don't have to go very far back, do you, before you get down to zero? And so this is one of these startling things. It's just like the tile mosaic of Palestrina, where it's this thing that just is in your face, so obvious and so grabbing that you can't let go of it. So I'm sure this is going to be hard to see. On the left, I have the population doubling every 40 years since the flood. If we make the assumption that the flood was in 2348 BC, okay, give or take a little wiggle room here, and we say the population was 6, and when I say 6, there were actually 8 people, but only 6 of them would have been repopulating because Noah and his wife didn't have any more children. So we have Noah's 3 sons, and the 3 sons' wives make 6 people. So 140 years later, there would have been 12 people. 140 years after that, there would have been 24. When we get down to in 1972, there would have been roughly, you say 3 billion people. And here I have in 21, 22, we have 6 billion people, 6.5 billion people. Well, we're in 2021, so we're 100 years shy of that. And we have 7 billion people. Now remember, this is just a rough estimation, and we're going over quite a large span of time. So there's going to be fluctuations there. Early on, people would have had 6 and 7 children. Now they have, a lot of countries are actually negative in growth rate, I think including the United States. But the world has kind of slowed down quite a bit. We don't have nearly as many children because we don't need them for labor. And I know that sounds ugly, but that's what you used to do. You lived on a farm, and it was hard work, and you had kids to help you. And the more you had, the more successful you were. It's kind of the opposite now. So on the left side of your screen, you see that pattern. You see all of a sudden that it's not really that hard to get to 7 billion people based on population doubling every 140 years. And the interesting thing that I threw on here just for fun is if you go on the old Earth evolution / whatever timeline, and we just say that human beings have been around for 50,000 years, even though we know it's longer than that according to them. If the population doubles every 140 years, as the model shows, then in the year 49,980, which is about 20 years shy of today, so in the year 2000, we'll say, the population would be following that model, would be that number there with all those zeros after it, starting with a population of 2 in year 0. So we just say year 0 is 50,000 years ago. There had to have been 2 people, right? Because they have to make a baby. So we start with 2. 50,000 years later, we end up with 587 sesquigentillion. Don't ask me to say that again. Sesquigentillion. That's a lot of people. In fact, I don't even think that they would fit on Jupiter, let alone Earth. That is 36 sets of thousands. So it'd be 35 groups of 3 zeros, and then 587 is the last set of 1,000, right? So, population growth thing, there's plagues. There's, volcano eruptions like Pompeii that wipe out huge populations. There's tsunamis. There's ice ages. There's warming periods. There's all sorts of things go into play. And you can nitpick this all you want, and that's fine. But the point is the young Earth model is closer to reality, far closer to reality, than the old Earth 50,000-year-old or 100,000-year-old human being model is. And, people make arguments all the time about, well, technology is getting better, we're living longer, whatever, we have medical advances, people, they don't die from a little infection. We have things like aspirin to bring down fevers. So much has changed, Chris. There's so much better nutrient in our food. I doubt it. I absolutely doubt it. I bet the food 100, 200, 300 years ago was probably better for you than the garbage that we eat now. Yes, we're living longer, but we are having far fewer children, by far. So those two contrast each other, and you say, okay, well, let's just, you look at the averages and you say, well fine. Then, so you say 140 years, population doubles. Sure enough, it throws us right at that mark that we're looking at. That is why I'm a firm believer in the young Earth model, regardless of what anybody says about me. They make fun of me, etc. That is what my Bible says. That is what I read, and that is what the world shows around me. So that's not the end of creation for us, because creation continues on. We've got a couple more episodes to go. We've probably got, I think, 3 or 4 left. I'm not 100% sure. But next week we're going to get back into Scripture. And there's some other marks in the Bible that are huge turning points in human history. And they're a part of creation. And I want to show you those. So we're going to go through those. And this kind of ends the Noah's flood section of this, I guess, is the way to look at it. So we've gone all the way from day 1 at this point up to about 4,369 years ago. Hopefully you enjoyed tonight. Didn't want to overwhelm you. I wanted to give you a couple examples that you can remember forever, right? Everybody can remember horseshoe crab. Everybody can remember Great Barrier Reef, the giant sequoia trees, bristlecone pine, and the population. Those are simple things that just keep you in check and just show you to question the old Earth model. Next week, again, we'll get back into Scripture. Not next week, next episode. It won't be next week. It'll be the week after. But then when we do that, the last couple episodes will be each week. So join me next time. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, leave a comment. If you didn't like it, leave a thumbs up. Give a thumbs up. Don't leave a comment. I hope you all have a great rest of the week. I look forward to my church people. Look forward to seeing you Sunday, 10:45. If you're watching this and you're not going to church, just come join us if you're in the Reedsville area, anywhere near, within 50 miles. It's worth the drive. And other than that, I love you. Jesus loves you way more. Y'all go out and be the Christians that Christ asked you.